Hello, and welcome to the panel discussion, Bridging the Bay Area Art World. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. This is the third in a series of panels organized by 8 Bridges and the last event of 2020. Thank you also to Rye on the Road, who have provided the panelists and maybe some of the audience members tonight with drinks. My name is Sarah Hotchkiss. I'm a senior associate editor for KQED Arts and Culture, and I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. Neal Benezra is the Helen and Charles Schwab Director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. He holds a PhD and MA degrees in the History of Art from Stanford University and an MA in the History of Art from UC Davis, and a BA with honors in the History of Art and Political Science from UC Berkeley. Previously, he was Deputy Director and Francis and Thomas Dittmer Curator for Modern and Contemporary Art at the Art Institute of Chicago. He does not have his cocktail with him right now, but he will be drinking the Crooked Stave Drip Line Stout, which is quite a string of words. Mari Fogarty is the director and CEO of the Oakland Museum of California. She graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Accidental College. Before joining the Oakland Museum in 2006, she was executive director of the Bay Area Discovery Museum. And before that, she spent 12 years at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in multiple positions, including Senior Deputy Director, Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs, and Associate Director of Development. Lori is drinking a hot toddy. There it is. And last but not least, Marty Robles is the brand new director of Headlands Center for the Arts. She holds an MA in Art and Design Education from the Rhode Island School of Design and studied art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is currently a programming partner for Prospect 5 New Orleans, which has been pushed back to 2021. Previously, she was the educator in charge of public programs and engagement at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and held leadership positions at the Perez Art Museum Miami, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Dream Yard Art Center. Today is her third day on the job, and she's drinking a Manhattan. And I am drinking a Dark and Stormy. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to everyone who's watching tonight. To start off on a note of mutual appreciation, I asked all of you to think about the other organizations represented here and see briefly what you admire or respect about their role in the Bay Area arts ecosystem. Lori, I'm going to pick on you first. Would you like to start us off with your take on Headlands and SF MoMA?
I'd love to, because they are two of my favorite institutions. So thank you, Sarah, for moderating tonight, and Neal and Mari, it's such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you to 8 Bridges for putting this together. So where do I begin with this love letter to these two institutions? I will say, as you mentioned, Sarah, I worked for 12 years at SF MoMA, so it is where I began my museum career, and I grew up there in a lot of ways, so very fortunate to be there at a time. When I started at SF MoMA, it was on Van Ness and in the 3rd and 4th floors of the War Memorial Veterans Building, and I still think of what is now known as the old building as the new building, so that's how far back it goes. And then with the Headlands, as you said too, I worked at the Bay Area Discovery Museum, which is just through the tunnel. The Headlands is on the other side of the tunnel, in the Marin Headlands, and I spent a lot of time there. And I guess when I think about these two institutions, what I really admire about SF MoMA is just the incredible quality of the programming there, and particularly the just unmatched, I think, capacity of the staff to produce miracles in those galleries. I think about projects over the years, actually projects, since I left many years ago, but, projects like the Olafur Eliasson exhibition, or Matthew Barney, or Bruce Conner, and just, what that takes. I know what that takes to pull off shows like that in every aspect of the work, and I just think the caliber of the team there in their ability to produce great projects is pretty unmatched in the Bay Area. So kudos, Neal, to you and your team for that. And the Headlands is just magic in terms of bringing together this incredible space and landscape with the ability for artists to go deep into their work and exploration. And when I picture it, I picture actually sitting in the communal space that David Ireland made, and I enjoyed events and meals and programs there, and just being transported through art and nature in a way that I can't think of any place else that does that like the Headlands. So I'm honored to be with you all leaders of these institutions that I admire and love.
Thanks, Lori. Maybe Mari, can you go next?
Sure. Yes, first of all, Sarah, thank you for sort of organizing us and helping prepare us for this presentation. Thank you, panelists, for participating. Excited about the conversation that is going to ensue. When I was thinking about what I would say, I'm actually coming as a sort of a outsider perspective to the Bay Area, moving there shortly in a short month. But I have admired both institutions from afar for some time. So I'm thinking about sort of my early years as an educator at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And, SF MoMA was an anchor organization in terms of international modern and contemporary art and its presentation. So I also remember the Olafur Eliasson exhibition and, researching that and visiting the galleries and just being amazed by the sort of kind of transcendental experiences you can have in those galleries because they're so inspiring. As an educator who has been very much interested in community engagement work, Oakland Museum has been on my radar for a very long time, and I admire the programming that they've done. I feel like Oakland Museum is a model in the field, and I think there's a lot to be learned. Prepping for this panel, I looked at the mission statement just to see how that sort of ties in, and I was really pleasantly surprised with the language of, helping communities create a more vibrant future for themselves and specifically Californians. So I love that idea of, just being so community oriented. And that's what I think Oakland Museum offers to the rest of the museum field is a really awesome example of that. So thank you both.
Thank you. And Neal.
So thanks to 8 Bridges, and Sarah, thank you for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to be speaking with Mari and Lori. And Mari, welcome to our cultural community. When I think of my 2 partners tonight, and their institutions, I think of 2 really singular organizations, not just in the Bay Area, but really in this country. So Headlands has such an extraordinary history of offering fellowships and residencies to artists. I'm regularly meeting artists who have spent time at Headlands through the years, which is really quite extraordinary. Artists from other parts of the country and sometimes other parts of the world. And when I think of Oakland, I think of Lori, the remarkable work that you've done in really understanding your community and grounding it in that community, and I really best in class in the country. I don't think there's anyone doing what the Oakland Museum and what you, Lori, are doing. So it's a pleasure to be with both of you tonight, and thank you.
Thanks, Neal. That was my cheesy, everyone says something nice to each other moment.
That was really good. That was fun.
I wanted to set the tone of this, it's about the connections between very disparate institutions and also leaders who are at very different points in their careers. As we look kind of back on 2020 and forward, this has been an incredibly difficult year, but also a year of great learning and growth. And I wonder if the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the struggles of the local arts community have shifted the way that the 3 of you think about your own institution's role within that ecosystem. And specifically, I'm wondering if you approach your job as a leader in a different way than you would have a year ago. And I don't have a person picked out to go first, but if someone would like to volunteer.
Well, I'm happy to go first. There have been a lot of learnings this year. I mean, this has been a year like no other, obviously, for museums in our history. And I know we've all thought a lot about this. We've had time to think in different ways and needed to do so. And I've been thinking about the fact that certainly our museum and probably most, art museums in this country have been focused for the majority of their history on works of art. I mean, that's been the what of what we do in museums, is that focus on, collecting great work and exhibiting great work and educating about great work. And if I've learned any one thing this year, it's that we need to now bring people up to the same level in terms of the way we think about what we do and who we do it for, whether it's our staff or our board or our friends or our visitors. I think the people side of the equation is now at a much higher level in the way we think about our organizations and what we do and what we mean in a community.
Yeah, yes, it has been an incredible year of learning with great humility and vulnerability, I think, for all of us. I guess I would say a couple things just about thinking about our role in the community and then leadership. I think for us, as Neal and Mari, kindly acknowledged, we've been at the work of community engagement for a long time, but I think what has shifted for us is now thinking about what it truly means to be in service to community and not just partnering with community or engaging our audiences in service to the museum's goals and objectives, but really what it means to offer our partnership and resources in ways that we might not have imagined before. Mm-hmm. And so, an example, and we can talk about it later, but the partnership that we've had with Black-led organizations in the Black Cultural Zone around preserving protest art in Oakland. So that is something that's shifted in my thinking. And I guess on the leadership side, what I would say is, I think the impulse in these moments of crisis, as we were facing in March and April and since, is a kind of command and control impulse as the leaders, that you have to make decisions and you have to come up with a plan and you've got to, forge ahead. And what I've had to really learn to understand even more is the importance of listening to other voices and knowing that there is wisdom throughout the institution, and really thinking about practices of shared leadership, which is something that I'm interested in and I've had to explore in new ways this year. So those are a few of the learnings.
Great. And for me, as I take sort of this leadership role and start at Headlands, I mean, part of the reason that I was so attracted to coming to Headlands is because they had been doing some of this work ahead of time, mostly internal, having conversations, really staff-led, working with the consultant to frame some of the conversations, and then also now moving towards thinking about conversations at the board level and beyond. And so the idea of, going into 2021 and starting to make some of these conversations, some of this work more public facing, I think is an interesting one, one that I think Headlands is, prepping for, and that we should be prepping for, especially just given the summer that we just had. In my own practice, it hasn't particularly shifted. I think it's just helped me to double down on a lot of the things that I have always found really important. I was working with this idea of community and organizations being sort of more relevant to the communities that they serve. Before we had this language, or before I had this language, I should say, around racial equity work that we're using today. In my time at various organizations, there have been moments where I have felt like I've had to go on repeat of, being an advocate for that message. And over the summer, it felt like, this is definitely a moment where people are listening, as you said, Lori, like it's listening, having empathy, leaning into difficult conversations. Like this is what the moment calls for. And I think there's more of an understanding that that's what needs to happen. So at the Met, we always talked about this work, and under the leadership of Sandra Jackson Dumont, we talked about this work as, trying to make it stick to the bones of the institution. And that is what I'm interested in with Headlands and our future. Is it's not just about a spectacle at a moment, or it's not just a single statement. It is really about prioritizing it for the long term, these conversations, and how it will shift practice permanently.
Thanks, Mari. And I just want to remind everyone who's watching that there's going to be a 15-minute period at the end of our conversation where we'll ask questions from the Q&A. So if you want to put questions in there, maybe wait till I'm done asking my questions so you don't ask the same ones. But feel free to enter your questions, and then we'll get to ask some of those at the end of our conversation. Except for one of us who is currently moving cross country. Most of us have stayed within very small orbits this year. I know mine is shrinking daily, it seems. And I know that institutions are thinking similarly, less out-of-town visitors, your audience is more local, and shows that involve big loans are harder to manage right now. I mean, beyond the fact that we're all closed. But how are you focusing your attention locally, both in terms of audience and the artists that you're working with? Maybe Lori, you can start off.
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, we're a bit of a unique, in a bit of a unique situation because we're very locally focused anyway. And, most of our audience is local, regional, and our content is, we always try to have even if we're exploring a subject matter that has broader California implications, we always try to have a strong Oakland focus. But I do think that even more now at this point, we are thinking about how to make that direct local connection. So, for example, the exhibition that we had planned to open this fall, and then we had planned to open it in January, and now we'll open it whenever we can open this spring or in the coming months, is called Mothership, Voyage to Afrofuturism. And, always a timely topic in Oakland, but our curatorial team and our experience development team really shifted the plans for the last section of the gallery to be even more focused on Oakland. And the work that's happening right now, to lift up Black voices, Black businesses, Black stories in our local community. So I think it's been part of our practice, but I think now even focusing more on what is the real relevance right now for the needs of our community in this moment is a lot of our focus right now.
And at Headlands, I know that there's going to be a focus on California artists for the foreseeable future.
That's correct. And when the lockdown first occurred, we put a halt to the Artist in Residence program, but then we did eventually move forward with our graduate fellowship program that focuses on Bay Area graduate students. And so we currently have students on campus, residents on campus, taking advantage of our studio space. And then our hope is that, in the summer months that we might begin again with some of our residency programs and launch our Bay Area Fellowship program, which will focus on Bay Area artists.
And Neal, you've got Bay Area Walls and a show that was going to open in December.
I'm thinking that about 1 month ago, we would have opened, if we had stayed open, a major Diego Rivera exhibition. They've been in the works for years. And like other museums that were organizing exhibitions to open in the fall, we had to postpone that for about 2 years. But what I'm excited about is that the mural that we're bringing, Pan American Unity, which has been for many, many years out at City College of San Francisco, we'll be bringing here this spring. And I'm really pleased, not just about that fact, but the fact that it's going to be on view in the Howard Street galleries, the Roberts Family Galleries off Howard Street, which are galleries that are free. So we're really looking forward to the opportunity to bring the community into the museum free of charge to see that great mural, which will be here for a couple of years. So that's on the one side, on the historical side, but we're also in the work planning and have completed the commissioning of 2 murals for the museum, and we have more to come. We really wanted to dedicate ourselves to artists working in the Bay Area who could come in the museum and make work with us. And we have other exhibitions that are focused on the local community. Creativity in Crisis is an exhibition that Corey Keller, our photography curator, is organizing that's going to focus on the work that's been done in people's homes, obviously, in this difficult time. Wow. So, we really think differently right now. In our particular case, about half of our visitors historically have been tourists. And of course, that's an enormous change, and it gives us all the more reason to focus in on the Bay Area and serving this community as well as we possibly can.
That's great to hear. That actually leads really well into my next question, which is fairly wonky. But there was so much that was supposed to happen this year that, just didn't. Like, I was really looking forward to the Tauba Auerbach show at SF MoMA and the Edith Heath show at the Oakland Museum. And I had more than one friend who was supposed to be in residence at the Headlands. And now, if they're out of state, I don't know when that will happen. And I'm just wondering logistically, I mean, you all have very different institutions, but like, how do you manage these scheduling issues? Does everything just get pushed down the line, or do equity and representation come into play as you're making decisions about what happens next now?
Oh man, it is just, it's never ending right now in terms of, plan and replan and new scenario and shift. And, some of it is really logistically driven about, when can we do this? When can we get loans? And some of it does take into account what's the right, excuse me.
Drink your drink.
Drinks are too strong.
It's the wrong drink, Lori.
Yeah. The harder stuff will serve you.
You want to pass for a second?
I'm happy to chime in. Well,
yes.
So in terms of equity and representation, I think that sort of shifts everything for us moving forward. And that's a lens that we will continue to understand how it works across the organization at all levels. As far as programming, one of the new programs this year that we launched was the Community Rapid Response Program, which was like a micro grant program that basically funds artists to do work within their local, within their community. So it's like a micro granting. We're looking to launch another iteration of that in 2021, and because it's been quite successful, it's also helped us to think about or the organization to think about how it could do this work beyond, beyond the campus. So it's something that we'll look to, potentially continue.
That's really interesting. And Neal, I mean, your schedule is booked out usually.
Yeah.
3 years.
Lori, I'll give you another minute to catch your breath. In our particular case, because so many of the exhibitions that we organize or schedule are in partnership with other museums. So we're either organizing a show that's traveling to other museums, or we're taking exhibitions from other museums. And I'll give you an example. We're organizing, Sarah Roberts, who's curator of painting and sculpture at the museum, has been organizing for some time a really extraordinary Joan Mitchell exhibition. Never been done before. And that exhibition is meant to be in a major museum on the East Coast and then go to Paris. And the museum on the East Coast had to drop out, and they were right in the middle of the tour. So we've had to shuffle our cards countless times since then to make that happen. And then there are other exhibitions that we've not been able to take for various reasons. So our exhibition scheduling process right now is, every week we're rethinking and adjusting, and of course not knowing when you can open and when you'll be closed, makes it really, really difficult. And we just have to be very nimble in everything we do now.
Thank you. I'm back. I will say, I don't think it was just the hot toddy, but too much time talking on Zoom calls. Thank you guys. All of the things that Neal just said about the logistics, I do think that one thing that is happening is museums thinking about their collections in new ways. And when temporary exhibitions are upended, how can we, utilize our own holdings in new ways and be nimble in that way, which is something we're very much thinking about as well.
So, there's not really, I think we can all say that there's not going to be a return to the before, that things will never be the same after. After is a word that I don't even know if it really applies, but the loss of life has been too great, and the systems that so much of our society is built on are unjust. So everything's going to have to be different from now on. And I wonder what changes you've adopted within your institutions that we should expect to continue after reopening. Some of these things are going to be, decisions you had to make out of necessity. Like, for instance, the Headlands Affiliate Artist Program had to end sooner than planned. But changes that will continue, things that we'll see, in the after, quote unquote, and feel free to be as specific as possible.
Well, I'm happy to go first. I would just point out two things really and both very, very important. One is that obviously we had some challenges this summer having to do with issues of race, and we all know that. And so coming out of that, the museum has quickly recognized that we need to do a better job with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have developed, and it's a work very much in progress, very robust, a work that involves trustees and staff working together to think differently about who we are and what we do and who makes decisions and all of the issues that are embedded in issues of race. So we're very committed to this work, and it's ongoing, and it will go on for some time. Because we want it to be, we want it to be something that becomes embedded in this museum for the long haul. And the other thing I'm really pleased about as well, equally pleased about, is that our curators have done a really outstanding job of working to diversify the works in our collection. If you were able to come to the museum today, which of course no one can, it would look very different than it did 1 year ago. But it's not just that we're acquiring works, we're putting really, I think, some terrific works that we've either purchased or been given on the walls. And the museum feels very different in terms of the work that we're presenting. So that I'm really pleased about that and eager for it to continue.
Just picking up on that, I do think it's an inside out, outside in kind of moment, right? What Neal referred to, I don't think that there's a cultural institution across the country that hasn't had to do its own reckoning around, race and equity in these last few months. And I think that will finally, hopefully at last, cause real change. As Mari, I love that, stick to the bones of the institution, real changes that are happening internally with our boards, with our staff, with our policies and practices. And I think I don't think there's any turning back from that at this moment. And I think there's going to be just new ways of working. I mean, the constant conversation around digital engagement and how prominent and prevalent that is becoming as part of our thinking. And, SF MoMA has long been at the forefront of digital and technology work. It was not something that we had put as much attention and resources to because our focus had been so much on our physical space. And it's not, I think the interesting thing at this moment is when your whole museum is coming to people through a screen. And it's not just, your social media, and it's not just, programming, it's everything you do. It's the way you engage your audience. It's the way you deliver content. It's the way you feature artists. It requires new ways of working. It requires kind of some of the silo busting, between curatorial and education and technology and development and event production in new ways that I think will actually help us think differently about that kind of blurry line between exhibition program and digital project in the future. So, and I guess the last thing I think will change for us is I think we will see our role in the city in a different way after all of this. I think we will see what it means to be a civic institution in a way that we hadn't before, which is even more as part of the ecology, along with artists and other arts organizations and civic organizations that are going to have to be part of reimagining, what our future is in the after, as you said.
I just want to point out that Lori means this physically, literally, because the Oakland Museum is opening up a corner of its campus to be more accessible to the public.
That's right, yeah.
And Mari, sorry.
Yeah, I would say at this moment, we're really thinking about our focus and our strength at Headlands as centering artists in the creative process and how that is so important during this time for imagining sort of what comes next. And so many times, especially those last 6 weeks as I prepare, as I prepare to move and all of that, so many people have told me how beloved of an institution they, that special connection with Headlands, and particularly around the mess hall and having these dinners and the, talking, and the idea of that you can go to Headlands and you can open a door and you'll stay there for 45 minutes and you'll learn something new. So we feel like we're really well positioned in that work to think to actually have these kind of conversations that might be more difficult, that might help to clarify our current moment, that you might walk away from. And what we're trying to do is leverage kind of those basic building blocks to think about the future and how that might look once we are able to have the full residency program back, once we are able to be more public about some of the work that we've done over the last year and a half or so. So that's sort of where our heads are at the moment.
Okay, this is one of my last questions. So if the audience would like to enter any more questions into the Q&A, have at it. Since the pandemic hit, kind of on an individual level, we've seen a lot of mutual aid efforts and support structures that have really popped up to fill some of the gaps, some of the many enormous gaps in our social safety net. And your institutions are operating at a different level, but I was wondering, kind of ending on a more hopeful and collaborative and bridgy note, if you have any meaningful stories of meaningful networks or collaborations that have come out of this time. And I know, Laura, you mentioned the Black Cultural Zone, but there might be other examples of things that have helped you get through this and will maybe remain on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I have never seen anything like this time in terms of just, the development of networks and mutual support and connections between colleagues and organizations in all sorts of different, kind of webs. So, here in Oakland, beginning at the end of February, when we were starting to hear about this and thinking about, what would be, when would we have to close and how would we decide? And pretty quickly, actually, 3 other organizations in Oakland, the Zoo, Fairyland, and Chabot Space and Science Center, the heads of those organizations and I began to meet weekly, and that has continued, and really thinking about how we collectively made decisions when to close and how we're, supporting each other through the different, ups and downs that we've had in the last few months. I think in the East Bay, we haven't had the kind of strong advocacy network that happens, that, is really in place in San Francisco, and seeing some of the quick advocacy that was generated to raise funds and to get city support in San Francisco. I began to work with some of my colleagues in the East Bay, Berkeley Rep and Cal Performances and, the Oakland Symphony, to try to galvanize a network and an alliance that we've never had in the East Bay among cultural institutions. On the national level, Neal and I are both involved with the Association of Art Museum Directors. I've never seen anything like the number of calls and programs and ways of supporting. And then, as you said, just working with organizations and new partnerships like around the Art for the Movement effort with the Black Cultural Zone. So I find that all of that enormously essential right now. I mean, just support, understanding, collegial relationships, just sharing of resources. Even the fact that this series of programs could happen with whatever it is, 9 cultural organization directors probably would have never happened pre-pandemic, to get everybody together in a way like this. So I do think it's something that has helped provide some resilience in this time, for sure.
Well, I would second really everything that Lori just said. The kind of community of art museums has never been closer, locally and nationally, and to some extent internationally. And one of the things that we're looking at is, are there really tangible partnerships that we can create here in the Bay Area? And we've got a couple of ideas that we're working on. It's premature to talk about them yet because they're just barely in the oven, but we're really eager to be good partners in this community. at a time when some of the smaller organizations are going to really be challenged financially. We're all challenged, but I think the smaller arts organizations have a special challenge that we all need to be very, very well aware of and support in any way we possibly can. So we've got a couple ideas that we're working on, and hopefully they'll come to fruition before too long.
And as a newbie on the sort of in the group, I will just I'm still understanding the past year and how that's affect the organization. But I will say just as I get to know the Headlands community, I can tell that there is a certain closeness that was required of this past year. Right? So the staff, the senior staff, the board, everybody who was involved in this decision making, who just needed to come together in a way, and with the rest of the Bay Area. But I can really sense that current, like moving into this, especially since the pandemic hit during a leadership change. So that's what I would sort of share about Headlands.
Thanks. I'm going to go to the Q&A because there's a really good question in here. How have the institutions dealt with the financial challenges of the situation? I mean, this is a big question, but this is from Peter Stansky. Thank you, Peter.
Since you mentioned the affiliates program and sunsetting the affiliates program, Headlands has chosen to basically fast track some of its master plan. So in 2018, the organization adopted a master plan for the next 5 years. It included this sunsetting of the affiliates program and really thinking about sort of Bay Area artists in a different way, more embedded into the residency program. That is the staple of the organization. So that's one of the ways that we have been able to weather this year, is really moving that forward, upping that, and then we'll be doing that with different parts of the master plan moving forward.
Yeah, I can speak to our situation. It's been a real challenge. I mean, I think Neal, what you said too about, just the impact on smaller organizations, and I think even more dire for performing arts organizations as well. So it's really very tough. We have been able to weather this. I mean, we did receive a PPP loan, which we put toward full retention of staff. That helped us for those first few months. We've had, we've received some really generous support from individual donors, and we received a major grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation as part of an Art Museum Futures Fund, which was really to mid-size art museums. So that's helped a lot. We have been able to retain our staff. The way we did it was through what we called a shared sacrifice model. So all of our staff went down to 3 days or 4 days a week. So essentially 20 to 40% cuts, and then equivalent reductions for compensation for executive leadership. And so we have been able to keep people on staff and hope to be able to do that into the new year. I think what the realization is that this is not going to be over when we open our doors. I think we are looking at a sustained period where we're going to have to make really difficult choices and likely operate as smaller organizations for a period of time, because we know the earned revenue is not going to bounce back immediately. We also receive important support from the city of Oakland, and the cities are in dire condition, and we know our city support is going to decline for the next couple of years. So it is, it's generosity from members and donors that are going to sustain us, but it's also going to be really difficult choices, unfortunately, that I think we're all having to make.
Yeah, I'm at SF MoMA, similar story. A rather large percentage of our revenue every year comes from what we call earned revenue, which is, of course, the sale of tickets and the work of our store and facility rental and things like that. And of course, with the closure since March, that revenue stream has dwindled to a trickle, barely a trickle. And so we've taken a number of different steps. We also received a PPP loan, which was a lifesaver and allowed us to sustain staff, with not just in compensation, but with health benefits, which of course are so important right now. We also have done some other things. Lori mentioned the participation that she and I have on the AAMD, the Museum Directors Association. And the Museum Directors Association put in place a temporary policy that allowed a museum to use proceeds from the deaccession of works of art which is normally restricted and historically been restricted to the purchase of new works of art, additional works of art, for a 2-year period to be able to use some percentage of those proceeds for what is called care of collections. And so that's allowed us to reallocate some of our deaccession proceeds in that way, which has been incredibly helpful. And I would also say that our trustees have been really magnificent. We have a kind of sustainability campaign underway led by our board chair and board president, and it's very, very important to the work we're doing. So I'm so grateful to our trustees and our community for stepping up and helping. But as Lori said, this is not going away. This is not a 1-year situation. We're going to be living with reduced means going forward. And in fact, here at SF MoMA, we're entering into some strategic thinking about the future, some revisioning of our strategic plan, which has been in place since 2018. And it has unassailable goals and ideas, but some of the tactics are going to have to be adjusted. It's the reality of the situation. So the light is not yet visible at the end of the tunnel.
Definitely, yeah. I'm going to read two, because one of these is not quite a question, but I just really love this comment. Kim Smith says, "Let me just speak on behalf of Bay Area artists. Should any of you find a big hole in your program in the next couple years, we'd be happy to step up and install a show similar to what the DeYoung has done with the DeYoung Open. It has been a wonderful experience." And then kind of a follow-up on that, an anonymous question asker said, "How can local artists interact with you? Will there be open portfolio reviews or an ability for us to offer ideas for shows or local artists we'd like to recommend?" What is how could the local arts community kind of get over that slight wall and into the minds of the people inside your institutions?
Oh, that's the perennial question, right? And our curators do, work a lot with local artists and in more normal times, make studio visits and review portfolios. And so I would say it will not change dramatically. I mean, when we are able to engage with artists, we will always be, working to try to connect with artists, and we'll continue to do that in a lot of different ways. I mean, for us, it is exhibitions, but we also do a lot of live programming where we bring in, multidisciplinary artists, including performing artists. Our Friday nights at OMCA has been a way that we can really engage a broad range of artists. So we'll try to resume that, that practice when we're able to get back to seeing people and being with people.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, as soon as we're open, we will bring back our dinners and have our, we have been doing virtual public programming, but other programming on campus will hopefully phase in as, we sort of phase out of the pandemic lockdown. So our staff is always at these events where we are excited about, as I said, this exchange that can happen on the campus, in the surrounding lands, in the studio. So we are trying to listen, particularly at this moment where we have had some sort of feedback from Bay Area artist communities about sort of how they want us to step up better for Bay Area artists. So we're looking to, again, start programs, as I've mentioned, think about launching this new fellowships, but also just really listen and be in partnership. And
yeah, at SF MoMA, we've been, as I mentioned earlier, we've commissioned a number of works that are murals, basically, in the museum. It's a project and a program we'd like to be able to continue. We have some funding for that through our campaign from a few years ago. And we've also commissioned a couple of projects that are going to be special exhibitions, particularly in our photography galleries that were meant to open, frankly, right about now in December, and of course we've had to put them off. So I think our curators are very engaged, perhaps more so than ever, or certainly in a long time, in this community, and making sure that they are getting out to the extent that one can right now, of course, digitally. Getting out and seeing work and making studio visits, virtually, and staying really in close touch with the artist community here.
There's a question from Bolton Colburn. All of you have, each institution has done its own version of online programming, sometimes starting with the massive, effort behind it and many departments and people working on it, like at SF MoMA. But Bolton Colburn asked, do you think of your online audience differently than the audience that might physically go to your institution? Are your goals different with these two audiences?
That is a very live question for the Oakland Museum right now. As I said, we're kind of, early on in our journey toward digital engagement. But I think what we have seen from other institutions is that there is that real opportunity to not only stay engaged with the audience that knows you and loves you, your members, your local community, but that institutions are seeing a lot of new new participants, people who have not traditionally, been part of their programming. And I do think that there's really that opportunity. And so we are thinking about how we slightly define our, our quote unquote target audience in a different way with digital programming. And I know there are questions about, do we see this continuing? I absolutely do. I do not think, hopefully we're not all on Zoom calls for, hours every day, but I do think that that's the expectation now, is that we will engage with our artist community, with our local community, and with audience members digitally. I think for us, the other thing we're really interested in exploring is more distance learning. I mean, we have a large educational effort. We're the Museum of California. We do a lot of curriculum and programming about California history and natural science and art, as well as art. And we serve students all over Northern California and the Bay Area, but that is now online. Those resources could be in the hands of, or on the screens of kids and teachers and families across the state and maybe beyond. So I'm really interested in how we can expand, particularly the educational audience for our programming.
So at SF MoMA, I think that the same, in a certain sense, the same comment I made about the artist community pertains to how we think about our digital community. So obviously, we're living virtually right now. It's the only wall of the museum gallery that's available. And there's no question that the digital world is only going to grow in importance in all of our lives. It's really important that we create virtual programs, digital programs that will, in time, return visitors to the galleries. Because seeing objects on a screen is fine, it's helpful, and it's obviously fundamental, and it's all we have right now. But it's not a substitute for seeing things live and in person. And so we really want to again focus on our local community in our digital work, so that when we are able to reopen and sustain our public hours, that people will return to our galleries, which is so essential in every possible way.
And I'm not sure that I have any more to add. I think we're all at this moment where we're thinking about digital engagement and how to make it more sort of experiential, particularly because many people are experiencing Zoom fatigue. So one of the conversations that I had this week, we even cited the drinks that we're holding today as an example of something that feels a little bit sort of fresh, right? That we're all sharing a drink, and that others are sharing drinks as well. And how can we think about that that in the context of Headlands and that food experience that I keep pointing to? So we're all just, again, trying to navigate this moment, stay connected with our audiences, and the creative process and studio visits and things like that. It can be challenging in just that sort of looking at those things through a box on the screen. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to push that in new ways.
I want to thank everyone who has put some questions in here. There's now over 50, and I am so sorry that I cannot ask all of them, because a lot of them are really excellent. One of them is from an anonymous question asker, and I thought it was really interesting. What do you see in each of your particular organizations as the barriers or resistances to change? a hard one.
That's not an easy question, but I would say that as this pandemic has gone on, one of the things that I've been really gratified to see is that whatever resistance to change there might have been is declining. And I think as this settles into our being the way it obviously has, I'm seeing a staff that is really thinking new thoughts, open to change, embracing the challenges, and I have to believe beginning to see those challenges as opportunities as we go forward. So I've been pretty gratified by what I've seen. People thinking new thoughts, acting in new ways. I've got some optimism there that I find pretty exciting.
I'm optimistic about it as well. I definitely think, the moment is on us of, don't leave a crisis. What is the expression? Don't let a crisis go to waste. Right. Don't let it, you Chicago folks, the Rahm Emanuel quote, right? But, and I think people do see the real need for change. I think that museums have structures and ways of doing things, whether it's the way boards are created, or the way hiring practices have been done, or the way exhibitions have been developed, or the way organizational structures have been set, that are just challenging to make changes to, and we've been slow historically to do that. And I guess that I think why change is really hard is because it starts with the individual. And really systemic change, especially around equity and anti-racism, begins at the very personal level, the interpersonal level, and then the structural and organizational level. And as we know, individual change of attitudes and behaviors is really, really hard. So that's the kind of work that we're trying to do. Is it's kind of, it's one thing to talk about what the museum should do. It's another thing to talk about what I should do. So I think that is why, in many ways, that change is very difficult, not just for museums, but for all the we're swimming in those waters, and we've been swimming in them for a really, really long time. So so it's hard to really make those true shifts that are going to make the real difference.
Yeah, and I think part of what I have seen at Headlands is that there's a real openness, and I am equally optimistic about the change that is ahead. But I also feel like these questions that we have been asking ourselves around diversity and racial equity and sustainability, all of that requires a certain lens. Like, you have to flex the muscle of looking at it through this racial equity lens. It is a skill set that you build, and I think some of the resistance to it can be, one is it doesn't always feel comfortable. And so it requires uncomfortable conversations. I think it also just requires understanding what's at stake. And so one of the things that one of the documents that I was pleasantly reviewing last night was, all these staff recommendations about big and small sort of systems that we could implement. And it was broken down into the recommendation, the reason, the rationale for the recommendation, and sort of what it says about our organization if we don't adopt some of these changes. And I felt like that was just such a powerful way to present some of the and give people the common language as to why we would adopt, looking at everything from sort of the way that we fundraise, to the way that we hold board meetings, to the way that we program. So it can be scary to step into that, but again, I think the context for this work is now in place because we're all kind of in the same same, it's in the air in a real way.
I love that third column, what it says if you don't adopt this practice. That's really interesting. I think this might be our last question because we are getting very close to the 7 o'clock witching hour, but one more anonymous question. What role, that's looking far, far in the future, what role do your institutions have in the healthy recovery of the Bay Area people and the local economy? There was another question that I didn't get to ask that was about kind of transforming the view of arts institutions as essential services. And I wonder if those ideas could be combined into your answers.
Well, I think you touched on this a bit earlier, and I know that we're thinking differently about our community, about the organizations in our community, hoping to develop some pretty meaningful partnerships, and being part of the, in a sense, the civic fabric that's going to rebuild this community, the Bay Area, not just San Francisco. That we reach out and contact and work with our colleagues as best we can. I think we've got a role to play there, no question about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, our focus is really, in the last few years, as we've thought about our impact on the well-being of our community, is around social cohesion. How do we bring people together, and especially people of difference and different perspectives and backgrounds, into a community and understanding and trust? And I think people are going to be desperate for that, for social cohesion after a time of social distancing. And I also think what we try to do is to lift up some of the untold stories. And I think that will continue to be part of our work, is to really make visible some of the stories of this time that are so important for people to see and know right now.
And at Headlands, our focus on thinking about time, space, and resources to really create is what we're hoping to offer, so that we can all envision, and communities can envision, and artists can be at the center of that envisioning of communities that thrive, a system that helps all of us thrive, and individuals that thrive, and what you need for that future.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being part of this tonight, and thank you to everyone out there watching, and for all the great questions, which I think will be stored and maybe visible to us all later. Thank you to 8 Bridges, and just cheers to the end of 2020.
Cheers. Great to be with you all. Welcome to the Bay Area again, Mari, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
All of you.